In history, nations who had the reserve currency lost total power, but it took decades to finalize. We know sovereign nations are now de-dollarizing. Do you think this time it'll happen faster? No, I think it'll just happen like it always does. There's nothing that would lead me to believe that it'll happen any faster. If anything, maybe even a little slower, because the dollar network is a lot more powerful than any other network that a reserve currency had, because the global monetary system is so interconnected. So it's something that probably started a decade ago, maybe longer, and it'll probably take 3 or 4 decades to play out. So, and this is always what you see. I mean, if you would have gone back into the 2020s and we would have had social media, you don't think that we would have been hearing the exact same story? How all of these countries are now de-dollarization, pounderization. I'm trying to turn that. It's not a de-poundization. Maybe that's the correct terminology, but that's what you'd be hearing on Twitter in the 1920s. That's what you would have been hearing on in the mainstream media. The Tucker Carlson of the 1920s, I'm sure, would have been saying something similar, and it would have been true. Yeah, everyone is depounding. We'll just call it that. And but still, it took a long time. It took a couple decades, and it didn't get finalized or formalized until 1944, Bretton Woods. But it's a process. Always is. And this is always how the process plays out. I mean, would you expect anything less? No, of course not. You wouldn't expect this to happen overnight. And so while the process was occurring, these are the headlines that you would expect to see. But the world doesn't go from having called $100+ trillion on their balance sheet to, well, I'm not going to say zero, but to a amount low enough to where it would bring another currency or a group of currencies to a point where the amount of transactions that group of currencies accounted for more than the dollar. Right now the dollar is about 65% of global transactions are settled. Then you look at FX, it's like, the dollar's, well, I think one half, like 90% of the transactions. I mean, it's astronomical. So yeah, it's going to go down to 65, and then it's going to go down to 60, and then it's going to go down to 50, then 40, then 30. But even when you're at 30, who's coming up in as far as second place? Is it the yuan? Okay, well, they're 2 or 3, 5% right now. So even with the dollar at 30 or 35, it still may be the major currency, although it's deteriorated to a significant degree. But that takes decades. Yeah, like I said in that last video, it's definitely something that's happening, that's for sure. And it's something you need to be cognizant of, but it takes decades. It doesn't happen in days, weeks, or years. And if you want to think through why, just go through a thought experiment of, instead of just focusing on the dollars that are on the asset side of the balance sheet, just take the whole global balance sheet and turn it into one. You got the dollars on the asset side, but then you got to realize that the majority of those dollars were created by lending them into existence. So you got 100 trillion on the asset side, you got 100 trillion on the liability side, those loans. So then once you think that through, even if Saudi Arabia dumps all their dollars, okay, well, that doesn't really change the asset side, does it? Because those dollars just go somewhere else, and then it doesn't change the liability side. So, that ratio doesn't really change unless the United States is able to create enough dollars to where they get outside of the system, to where that balance or that ratio would be changed to a degree, to a point where it would actually impact the dollar value against other fiat currencies. See? And if you think that, okay, I mean, I went through that thought experiment in my video where I said, say they just print up 10 trillion and Janet Yellen just drops it from a helicopter. Okay, well, how do those dollars get outside the United States? Well, that'd be a trade deficit. Okay, that's, let's say, 1.2 trillion a year. All right, great. So now you've got those currency units leaving, and those currency units were created without creating an offsetting liability. So you're not creating more future demand by lending them into existence. Okay, so then that 1.2 gets out circulating. Okay, well, now you got 1.12 trillion to offset the, let's say, 100 trillion in liability. See, it's not that much of a difference, especially if the global economy is declining and you have velocity going down. There still might be even more demand for dollars, even though the supply increased slightly. So you just got to think through that stuff. And when you do, you realize that, yeah, this is it's good to think about, go through these thought experiments, but this stuff just takes a long, long, long time. And, think about how, I mean, and I got this from Brent Johnson. Like right now, if you travel outside the United States, English is spoken in a lot of different countries. Like that's kind of the default language. Like here in Colombia, it's Spanish and English. And even in Hong Kong, you got Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, but then you got English. I mean, English is just like the United States dollar. So just think if I told you that the BRIC countries were coming up with their own currency or their own language to compete with English for global hegemony. You'd say, okay, well, English is probably pretty secure because it's tough to switch to a new language. Well, yeah, it's tough to switch to new currency units. Now, it's easy to do that if you're just an individual. The average Joe and Jane, you can just switch from using dollars to yuan or dollars to euros or yen or something like that pretty easy. But for the entire global monetary system to do it, that's a whole different ballgame. And if you think Google has a strong network effect, if you think Facebook or Twitter has a strong network effect, that's child's play compared to the US dollar. I would argue the US dollar has the strongest network effect of anything we've ever seen in human history. So then most people say, oh, George, okay, well, how the Fed's going to print so much money, the government's going to print so much money, it's going to create inflation here and the dollar's going to tank. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely, you're right. 100%. I don't know if I'd agree with the mechanics there, but you're right. We're going to have consumer price inflation in the United States. But that doesn't mean the dollar is losing its reserve status. It doesn't really have anything to do with that. It may, but most likely will not. You go back to the 1970s, you go back to the 1940s. For heaven's sakes, the 1940s were a massive inflationary decade. And we had 1947, the CPI in the United States got up to 19%. 19%. And that's in the decade where the dollar formally became the world reserve currency. So you've got to compartmentalize things, and you can't conflate what's happening in the United States with the amount of currency units that are circulating, chasing goods and services, and you can't conflate that with what's happening to the dollar outside of the United States with this $100 trillion balance sheet. They're two separate things. So anyway, off that rant. Good question.